From the Forbidden Case Files of Old New England, The Shadow Farm, Chapter 3. The cab ride from Indianapolis to Brownsburg, as far as Lance could afford to pay a cab, was uneventful, save for the incessant drizzle that began shortly after leaving the city. The driver, an older man with a face etched in deep lines from years on the road, didn't say much, and Lance was grateful for the silence. It gave him time to think, to prepare himself for what he might find in Liston, and to recall the last time he and Frank had worked together. That had been in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a little over 2 years ago. The case had started as an ordinary insurance investigation, an arson job on a warehouse near the docks. The warehouse was owned by a small shipping company that had fallen on hard times, and the fire seemed suspiciously convenient. Lance had been the one to go out and examine the charred remains, sifting through the blackened debris for clues. It was there, among the ashes and twisted metal, that the arsonists, hired thugs, as it turned out, had found him. He could still remember the taste of blood in his mouth, the feeling of his ribs cracking under the relentless blows. He'd been sure he was going to die there, beaten to death in the ruins of a warehouse no one would miss. But then, just when everything had gone dark, he'd heard the sharp crack of a gunshot and the weight of his attackers had lifted. Frank had been there, fresh off checking the titles on the warehouses, and had shot one of the men in the arm while the other fled. The police arrived soon after, and under pressure the wounded arsonist had confessed everything. It had been one of the last good paydays Lance could remember, and it had reinforced his belief that having a partner to watch your back was something worth missing. That had been Lance and Frank's last case together, due to their differing objectives. Lance took cases that interested him, or more truthfully, that terrified him. He had helped Miskatonic University find ancient clay tablets with stories of the time before man even first crawled on the face of the planet, assisted local police in matters that were considered beneath the rank and file of the police force, such as trying to find the person who killed several fallen ladies of the evening, very reminiscent of those killings a few decades before in Whitechapel. Lance never did crack that case, but was convinced he had found the weapon used, a blade he had listed as cursed. The police were not amused. Frank, on the other hand, being one of the finest detective Lance had ever known, had a different reason for the caliber of cases he took. He liked to eat on a regular basis and felt he was due the same things in life a college-educated gentleman was due. He took cases that paid well and were, in Lance's opinion, safe and boring. This was what caused a rift in their working relationship. Frank staying out in the Midwest, Lance returning to Arkham. The cab pulled to a stop outside a small diner in Brownsburg. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dim glow over the rain-slicked street. Lance paid the driver and stepped out, his shoes splashing in the puddles on the pavement. Brownsburg was one of those small rural towns that roll up the sidewalk at sunset. Most of the businesses on Main Street were either closed or currently were closing. The diner was nearly empty, just a few locals nursing their coffee, and the smell of bacon and eggs lingered in the air. He took a seat at the counter and ordered a cup of coffee, black, no sugar. As he waited for his coffee, Lance asked the waitress if Liston had a local paper. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a warm smile, and she shook her head. "No local paper, mister. The County Gazette's all we've got around here. Covers Liston, Brownsburg, and a few other small towns. Anything newsworthy gets printed there." Lance nodded his thanks, making a mental note to check out the Gazette's office. The coffee arrived, steaming and bitter, but Lance drank it gratefully. He paid for the coffee and left the diner, stepping back out into the drizzle. The streets of Brownsburg were quiet. The town would be completely shut down in another half hour. He walked down Main Street until he found the office of the County Gazette, a small unassuming building with peeling paint and a single window displaying the latest edition of the paper. Inside, the air was musty, and the dim lighting made the place feel even smaller than it was. The clerk at the front desk was a spinster of indeterminate age, her grey hair pulled back into a tight bun. She looked up from her knitting as Lance entered, a faint flicker of interest in her eyes. Lance smiled and leaned on the counter, laying on the charm. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm doing a bit of research, and I was wondering if I could take a look at some of your older publications." She never acknowledged Lance's presence, except to crisply state that the Gazette was closed and would reopen at 9 a.m. Lance leaned over the counter a bit more attempting his best lost puppy dog look. "I'm not from here and haven't had much luck today with finding some information I need, information the Gazetteer may have in its records." The clerk's head tilted slightly, but her stern demeanor did not change. Lance continued, "Luckiest thing that has happened to me today was getting to make your lovely acquaintance, Mrs. Just Miss Jagger, no husband," the clerk replied. Her expression softened slightly and she nodded, clearly appreciating the attention. "Well, I suppose I could let you into the records room for a little bit. Not many folks come by looking for old news these days, and I still need to lock up the offices and print room." Lance followed her to the back of the office, where a small room housed dusty shelves stacked with bound volumes of past editions of the Gazetteer. "Try not to be too long. I'll be back in a while, Mr. Hughes. But call me Lance, please, Miss Jagger." She visibly blushed, mumbled, "Dora, you can call me Dora," and left Lance to his research. He spent the next hour leafing through the old papers, searching for any mention of the Hendrickson farm. Most of what he found was mundane. Births, deaths, the occasional scandal involving the mayor's daughter. Liston, it seemed, was a sleepy little town, barely 200 residents with nothing much going on. Lance backtracked into the public records, specifically births, deaths, and marriages. He found scant information on the Hendrickson family, primarily death notices, no birth or marriage notices. The death notices offered no additional insight, no next of kin mentioned, no burial location or service location, not even a funeral home listed. Lance estimated the farm had been in the family's possession for about 3 generations, handed down from Orville Hendrickson on down to his great-grandson, Jacob. Just as Lance was beginning to think he'd been wrong about finding any answers here, he came across a short article in the Gazetteer's crime archives. It was dated some 15 years earlier. The story mentioned the Hendrickson farm being searched for a missing scrapman. The scrapper had been making rounds to all the farms, clearing away scrap metals they had, and selling second-hand appliances he had fixed. He had not been seen in 2 weeks and missed several appointments. The report had a copy of the police interview with Jacob Hendrickson, with notes stating he was the only person living on the farm, denied seeing the scrapper, and that Hendrickson appeared in poor health like he had not eaten in some time. His mood was listed as agitated and appearance as disheveled. The local police made a cursory search of the property, but found nothing. The last page of the report had a photo of Jacob Hendrickson, a man who appeared to be in his 70s, with long, unkempt hair, a salt and pepper beard, and a wild, trapped animal look to his gaze. He was shirtless and emaciated, his ribs pressed hard against the skin. He was a harsh-looking man, who probably had lived a harsh life, Lance thought. Lance dug deeper into the crime reports and found another from 1900, just a small complaint form, claiming several cows had been found on the outskirts of the Hendrickson farm, dead. The report stated the cows had been drained of all fluids, their eyes missing, and strange black burns found on their skin. The cow's owner wanted to start legal proceedings against Orville Hendrickson for the mutilated livestock. The writ continued that the sheriff suggested the farmer speak with Orville, and if Orville or his farm was responsible for the dead cows, to arrange a fair compensation. The report was closed when it showed the farmer and his family moved away unexpectedly a few days later. A reclusive, now deceased farmer, an old farm with a strange stone circle in the woods, and rumors of livestock mutilations. It was all connected somehow. But how did it tie into Frank's disappearance? Frank had just been trying to find an heir to the farm, yet something had gone horribly wrong. Lance gathered his notes and allowed Dora the clerk to escort him from the Gazetteer's records room, along with a promise of a lunchtime meeting at the diner, if Lance had the time, of course. Frustrated with his lack of clues, Lance made his way back to the diner, hoping for one last cup of coffee before he left town. But when he arrived, the diner was closed, the lights off, and the door locked. The rest of Main Street was just as quiet, the shops dark and shuttered. The sun had set and the darkness swallowing the town in shadow. Lance figured it was about 10 miles further west to Liston, and with no other options, he began to walk along the dusty old road, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the pale sliver of moon that hung in the sky. As he walked, he could hear the baying of coyotes in the distance, their cries following him down the road. Continued in Chapter 4 of The Shadow Farm.